All right, let's dive into the world of trade finance. Well, not the old school kind. We're talking about how DeFi, decentralized finance, could completely change how businesses trade internationally. Our guide for this deep dive. An article from Trade Finance Global. It's called DeFi in Trade Finance, Fulfilling the Promise of Globalization.
Hmm. Sounds pretty interesting, right?
It really does, yeah. And the potential is huge. We're basically looking at whether this new tech can make trade processes, those complicated trade processes,
Yeah.
way smoother and what that means for businesses, big and small, trying to navigate the global market.
Exactly. So before we get lost in the world of DeFi,
Hmm?
maybe we need to take a step back for a second.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick trade finance 101? Like, what exactly are we talking about when we say trade finance? That's a good point. It's easy to think everyone knows all about this stuff. But really, trade finance helps companies manage the risks and make sure payments go smoothly when they're dealing with suppliers and buyers in different countries. So imagine you're importing coffee beans from Brazil. You need to know for sure that those beans are going to arrive. And the supplier in Brazil needs to be certain they'll get their money, even though you're so far apart.
Okay, so I'm starting to get how complex this can be. It's more than just sending an invoice and hoping for the best. So how does the traditional system work?
Traditionally, banks are the middlemen. They handle things like letters of credit, which are basically guarantees from the buyer's bank that the seller will get paid when they've done their part. There's also supply chain finance, which helps companies manage their cash flow by letting suppliers get paid earlier.
So the bank's like a referee, making sure everything's fair. But even with these systems, the article mentions some problems. What are the biggest pain points with traditional trade finance?
Right? The article pointed out some key issues. Traditional trade finance can be incredibly slow and bureaucratic, tons of paperwork, manual processes,
Yeah.
and a lot of back and forth between everyone involved. It can be a nightmare, especially for smaller companies who might not have the resources for all that.
So a classic case of hurry up and wait. I bet that can really hold back a company's growth internationally.
Absolutely. And then there's the lack of transparency. It's hard to track goods and payments through the system,
Mm.
which can cause arguments and break down trust between partners. And this is where things get interesting, because the article suggests that DeFi could be the answer.
DeFi to the rescue. Okay, for those of us who don't really understand this whole blockchain thing, can you explain it simply? What is DeFi and how could it fix these problems?
Sure. Imagine a digital ledger
Hmm.
that's spread across a huge network of computers,
Yeah.
making it basically impossible to tamper with. That's blockchain. It's like a super secure database that everyone shares. And we can build something called smart contracts on top of this blockchain. These are agreements that automatically enforce the terms of a deal when certain things happen.
So instead of relying on banks and all that paperwork, these smart contracts take over, automating things and cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. Now, think about applying that to trade finance. Let's say you're a clothing company importing fabric. With DeFi, you could pay your supplier as soon as the shipment arrives at a certain port, all thanks to these smart contracts. No more waiting 90 days for payment to clear, which frees up your cash and lets you focus on growing your business.
Wow, that's a big difference. And it sounds like the increased transparency would also build trust between buyers and sellers.
Absolutely. It's all about creating a system that's more efficient and trustworthy. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. The article is really excited about the potential for increased efficiency and access to finance, especially for smaller players in the global market.
Okay, I can see why everyone's so excited about this. But before we get carried away with all the possibilities, I have to ask, are there any downsides to using DeFi in trade finance? Are there any reasons to be hesitant about this technology?
That's a great question, and it's important to be realistic. While DeFi have incredible opportunities, there are definitely some challenges we need to think about. One of the biggest is regulatory uncertainty. The rules for DeFi are still being figured out. Governments and regulators are still trying to figure out how to handle this new world of decentralized finance.
So it's like navigating uncharted territory, which can be pretty scary for businesses. Is that uncertainty making people hesitate to use DeFi?
Absolutely. It's hard to commit to a system when the rules are still changing. And then there's scalability. Can DeFi platforms really handle all the transactions that happen in global trade every day? We're talking about a massive amount of data and processing power.
It's like trying to fit an ocean into a teacup. And I imagine trying to make these DeFi solutions work with existing trade finance systems, many of which are still paper-based. Must be a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. It's not a simple plug-and-play situation. And of course, we can't forget about cybersecurity risks. While blockchain itself is super secure, smart contracts aren't perfect, there's always the chance someone could find vulnerabilities and exploit them.
So it's not a flawless system. There are definitely some kinks to work out before DeFi becomes a go-to solution for trade finance. But with all these challenges in mind, where do you think this is all headed? Will DeFi live up to the hype and really revolutionize global trade?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's still early days, and there are definitely hurdles to overcome, but the potential is undeniable. I think it's more likely that we'll see DeFi solutions gradually being integrated into the existing system, rather than a complete overnight change. Think of it as a collaboration between traditional players and DeFi innovators, combining the best of both worlds.
A hybrid approach, mixing the stability of traditional finance with the flexibility and innovation of DeFi. What could that collaboration look like in reality?
Imagine banks using DeFi platforms to streamline their back-office operations, cutting down costs and making things more efficient. Or picture small businesses using DeFi to get funding that they couldn't get before.
So instead of replacing traditional finance, DeFi makes it better. It fills in the gaps and creates a fairer system for everyone. That's a pretty exciting prospect. But before we jump into what this future might look like, let's look at some real-world examples of how DeFi is already being used in trade finance today.
Great idea. Let's move on to part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll explore some fascinating case studies from the article.
Okay, so we've talked about the basics. Traditional trade finance has its problems, and DeFi could be the answer to a more efficient and accessible system. But let's get specific. Are there actually businesses out there using DeFi in the real world of global trade?
Oh, absolutely. The article we're looking at highlights some great examples. One that stood out to me was a clothing company. They were struggling with those traditional payment terms, having to wait a whole 90 days to get paid. It was a huge strain on their cash flow, and it limited who they could work with.
Yeah, that sounds like a major headache. So how did DeFi help them break free from that?
Well, DeFi platforms can handle real-time payments. So this clothing company could pay their suppliers as soon as the goods were delivered,
Yeah.
and everything was checked out. They completely skipped those long payment delays.
That's a total game changer. Imagine what a company could do with that kind of financial freedom. They could get better deals with suppliers, expand their product lines, maybe even take some risks on new ventures. It seems like it would really level the playing field for smaller businesses who often get squeezed by the traditional system.
Exactly. That's one of the most promising things about DeFi. It has the potential to empower businesses that have been at a disadvantage. And speaking of leveling the playing field, there's another case study that shows just how efficient DeFi can be for complex transactions. Remember the metals trader we talked about?
Right.
The one dealing with suppliers and buyers in multiple countries?
Oh, yeah, that sounded like a logistical nightmare. Keeping track of all those moving parts, the paperwork, the payments, it was mind-boggling.
It was the perfect example of where DeFi could really shine. Instead of dealing with mountains of paperwork and multiple intermediaries, they could manage all those transactions on a single DeFi platform. The article talked about using smart contracts to automatically track shipments and payments, which would streamline everything and dramatically reduce the chance of errors or delays.
I can see how that would be incredibly valuable for businesses in global supply chains, especially those working with raw materials or commodities. We're talking about lower costs, faster turnaround times, and maybe even fewer disputes. But even with these success stories, I keep thinking about those challenges we discussed earlier. How do we address those concerns and make DeFi a more realistic option for businesses?
It's about finding the right balance between embracing innovation and addressing those valid concerns. Collaboration is a key part of this. Traditional financial institutions, with their infrastructure and expertise, need to be open to partnering with DeFi innovators.
It's like they each have a piece of the puzzle. The traditional players bring stability and experience, and the DeFi startups bring fresh ideas and tech know-how.
Exactly. And that's what makes this such an exciting time. We're seeing this convergence of traditional finance and DeFi starting to happen. There's more and more dialogue between banks, fintech companies, and DeFi startups, all exploring ways to work together.
It's like they're realizing they need each other to really unlock the potential of this technology. But it's not just about the technology itself, is it? There are bigger questions about how DeFi can shape a better future for everyone involved in global trade.
You're absolutely right. We need to think beyond just making things more efficient. How do we make sure DeFi is used to promote sustainable development and reduce inequality? How do we empower smaller businesses and create a fairer trading system?
Those are some big questions. It sounds like we need to be mindful of the potential downsides of this technology, while also using its power for good.
Exactly. We need to consider the ethical implications of DeFi and make sure it's used to create a more inclusive and sustainable world. So, as we move on to the future of DeFi and trade finance in Part 3. Let's keep those broader goals in mind.
So, we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we, from how traditional trade finance works to the amazing possibilities of DeFi. We've seen how businesses are already using this technology all over the world, and we've talked about some of the challenges that need to be addressed before DeFi can really revolutionize global trade. Now, let's look ahead. What trends and developments should we be watching in the world of DeFi and trade finance?
Well, one really exciting trend is the growing collaboration between traditional finance and DeFi. We talked about this before, this idea of a hybrid model where banks and DeFi platforms work together, each bringing their own strengths to the table.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see these two worlds coming together. They seemed so separate before. What are some real-world examples of this collaboration happening?
We're seeing banks starting to use blockchain technology to streamline their back office operations. Those behind-the-scenes processes that can be slow and expensive. This could save banks a lot of money and make them more efficient, which could mean better services for their customers. And then there's the other side of it. Banks partnering with DeFi platforms to offer new and innovative trade finance products to their clients.
So it's not about DeFi replacing traditional finance, but more like enhancing it, filling in the gaps, and creating a more complete and efficient system.
Exactly. It's about creating a win-win for both sides, where ultimately businesses and consumers benefit.
And what about the regulators? Are they keeping up with all these rapid changes?
That's a good question. It must be tough for them to create rules for something that's changing so fast.
Yeah, I can imagine this.
Regulators all over the world are definitely paying attention to DeFi, and they're starting to develop frameworks that encourage innovation while also managing risks. It's a delicate balance. Too much regulation could stifle the growth of this new industry, but too little could lead to instability and maybe even chaos.
Sounds like finding that sweet spot between supporting growth and making sure things are stable is really important for the future of DeFi. What about the impact on developing countries? We talked about how DeFi could empower businesses that haven't had access to the global marketplace in the past.
Absolutely. DeFi has the power to level the playing field and create economic opportunities. For those who haven't been well served by traditional financial institutions, think about small businesses in developing countries, finally being able to get affordable financing, or being able to connect directly with buyers in other parts of the world.
It's exciting to think about how DeFi could help bridge that gap and unlock economic potential in places that have often been left behind. But it's not as simple as just making the technology available, right? We need to think about the digital divide and make sure everyone has the tools and infrastructure they need to participate in this new economy.
That's a crucial point. In many parts of the world, access to technology and the internet isn't a given. If we really want DeFi to be a force for good, we need to make sure it's accessible to everyone, not just those who are already connected.
It's a good reminder that technology alone isn't enough. We need to address the underlying inequalities and create a digital ecosystem that's more inclusive. And speaking of challenges, what about the environmental impact of DeFi? There's been a lot of talk about how much energy blockchain technology uses, and it's something we need to take seriously.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. Some blockchain networks can use a lot of energy. But the good news is that there are more sustainable options coming out. Many DeFi projects are moving towards consensus mechanisms that are more energy efficient. And there's a growing awareness within the DeFi community about how important sustainability is.
That's good to hear. It seems like for every challenge DeFi faces, there's also a push to find solutions and create a system that's more responsible and ethical.
That's what I love about this space. It's always changing and adapting. It's like watching a new industry being born,
Yeah.
full of people who are passionate about building something better.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind as they continue to explore DeFi and trade finance?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that DeFi has the potential to change global trade in amazing ways, making it more efficient, transparent, and accessible for everyone. But it's still early, and there are challenges we need to address. We have to be aware of the risks and approach this technology responsibly, making sure it benefits all stakeholders and helps create a more sustainable and equitable world.
That's a great way to put it. This deep dive has been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners feel inspired to keep exploring this exciting and rapidly changing space. Thanks for joining us.